No one comes on this podcast and says, I was working for the Prime Minister and now I'm selling real estate.
As I always say, I used to have a proper job. Now I just sell houses. So
You got recognized as one of the top 30 brokers in the UAE. What does it take to become one of the top 30 brokers? And
I had to pay a lot of people off.
You pay? Okay, that's fine.
I actually mortgaged a house to try
all
get in
right.
there.
Okay. You're quite entrepreneurial. Career
It's weird
path to
though,
career
because
path.
I actually don't think I am.
Okay.
I still think that it's really weird. I've always thought that I'm incredibly conservative, scared to make big change. I don't take enough risk. If you actually look at the facts, I probably have done that, but it's never felt like I've done it.
What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of The Real Ones. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Andrew Cummings, Head of Residential at Savills MENA. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Ready to roll. Curious to see what you're going to ask me.
Oh, no, I'm so excited to get into this. But before I get into all the serious stuff, I have to ask you, at the age of 7, what did you want to become?
Oh, Lord. Something really nerdy, I've no doubt. I probably wasn't quite old enough yet to want to go into politics.
Right.
But I was very big into, back then there were two things. I was big into science and dinosaurs, so probably a paleontologist. But the other thing is I was mad on God, I'm so old, like the Hardy Boys and books and things like that, so probably a detective.
Okay, gotcha. So some intersection of Ross from Friends and Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, oddly, because obviously everyone wants to be Chandler, but I definitely would have fallen more down the Ross side.
The paleontology side. No, of course, that makes sense. So I know a little bit about your journey from stalking your LinkedIn profile, but tell me about your story and, where did it start and how do you end up here?
Yeah, look, it's a very different one to what most people have. I think, when I was growing up, my father was in the Air Force. We moved around a lot. When I was 13, I got shipped off to boarding school, which was kind of ironic because my dad always used to say when I was growing up, if you don't behave, I'm going to send you to boarding school. Then one day he called me in and he's like, guess what? So I thought for a while I'd done a lot wrong. And when I was going up through school, I sort of never really knew what I wanted to be. I was the first in my family not to do GCSEs, but to do A-levels, first to go to university. I went to university and, I sort of stumbled into doing biochemistry because, in my school, if you were smart, you sort of did science. I sort of liked science, so I went down that route. Yeah. Then I was actually going to join the police after university. I'd applied, and then my best friend was like, look, you don't want to do that. Like, you can do more. So I went back to uni, did a master's degree in terrorism, and then went into the British government, basically. So I thought then, I found the perfect job for myself. I did a bunch of interesting jobs actually in the Treasury Department in counter-terrorism, which culminated in working in 10 Downing Street for the Prime Minister. And then, things changed. And I was like, we need to do something different. So I quit. Ended up working for a year for a royal family in this region, giving some sort of private advice, and then went into management consultancy. But then again, really close to government. I was just working with governments all the time, trying to do reform and things like that. Right. But I was doing it in some funky countries. So, I worked in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan, Somaliland, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia. So last time I applied to go to the US, the visa process was fun.
I'm sure.
And then I moved out here actually because I was tired of working in war zones, and was like, what would be better was to actually come and, why don't I live in Dubai and I can do consulting work in the UAE and Saudi. So we set up an office here, and, that was the plan. And then 18 months later, somehow I quit and moved into real estate. So I think probably one too many episodes of $1 Million Listing, New York and LA probably got me into it.
Yeah. So I think that's very interesting. I've never heard this before. No one comes on this podcast and says, I was working for the Prime Minister and now I'm selling real estate. So you have to...
As I always say, I used to have a proper job. Now I just sell houses. So it's a little bit different. Yeah.
Both happen to be stakeholder management, people, businesses. So
Very
I'm
much.
sure that helps a lot. But talk to me about that transition in your head. Obviously, it's not easy to kind of the gravity of the kind of things that you're doing. You underplayed your role in the government kind of thing quite a lot, but you were head of a secure, like, you know, on the security
Middle
side.
East, North Africa, and North America in the National Security Council.
Yeah, that's not small. Like,
No,
that's
no,
pretty significant, right?
Yeah.
So you go from national security, working, as you said, in war zones, and then you have to go to selling super prime residential kind of stuff. How does that happen?
I think, look, it's really important when people are, I don't want to say growing up for fully grown adults, but you don't really know what you want to be. You know, when you're coming up, whether it's when you're going through school, whether you're at university, whether you're starting out in your career, you think you know what you want. But what you think you want at the time is shaped by your experience and your surroundings. And if those surroundings have been relatively limited, then that's what's going to shape you. You know, if you're growing up in the UK, you get told, be a doctor, be a lawyer. And I did want to be a lawyer for a long time. But, you know, now I sit here and I look at my own daughter and I'm like excited because she's surrounded by entrepreneurs, business owners, you know, people who are, you know, I look at real estate brokers who are making, you know, millions of dollars, and like, you know, that was something that was sort of never on the horizon. So it's interesting because I don't want to say that the transition was hard. I never found it hard because, as you said, actually, my entire life has sort of led to this position. And I get very frustrated sometimes. I say, oh, why didn't I know I could do this? Why did I not come and do this in my early 20s like so many people here? But I probably wouldn't have been any good at it. You know, my life experience of my dad being in the military, we moved all the time. So I'd drop into a new city, new country, have to adapt, being adaptable. And then in all of those different jobs I had, it was service culture. You know, my job in government, you were not the minister. You know, so ministers decide, civil servants advise.
Yeah.
So my entire job was, how can I influence that person to do what I think is the best course of action? Be that in something, you know, in the counter-terrorism sphere, or be it, you know, during the Arab Spring, when, you know, working with the Prime Minister to help craft him how he might approach a world leader to, you know, change their mind. Everything is about persuasion, and you realize now that's actually selling.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what I learned throughout that was the skills that basically set me up for a role which I've now come to, you know, really love, which is quite nice. And also, look, you know, it's not hard, is it? You know, you walk around houses, and I just came from a beautiful villa now. Like it's pretty fun, so you can't really complain.
So persuasion, negotiation, these are things that you've understood to a different level. How do you, what would your advice be for someone that's trying to grasp persuasion and negotiation? How do they, what are the key pointers that you have for them?
Look, 90% of agents tell you what they think you want to hear. And that's actually not necessarily the right approach. You know, you have to get in the mindset of the person you are trying to persuade. What do they want? What are they trying to achieve? Be that in a, you know, policy perspective in government. You know, with a particular, I remember. No, I can't talk about that one.
Confidential.
I remember with dealing with a world leader in this region for the UK government, and that world leader is very demanding. You know, they have very clear views on what they want from the UK government, and we had to try persuade them to do certain things. Right. And the French were incredible at it. The French basically would put up an airbase, and say, look, we've done a joint airbase with you, but they hadn't. They would have put up like a plaque and said, that's an airbase. Whereas we would have, you know, 100 planes there and we wouldn't get the credit. So what you have to do is understand, what do they really want, and how can you make an argument that resonates with their values, their worldview, rather than your own. And I think it's the same when you're dealing with, you know, buyers and sellers here. You know, if someone's a seller, why do they want to sell? How can selling benefit them, as opposed to just saying, oh, but you can get this amount of money and you can reinvest. They're not really looking to reinvest. Why would they care? I just came from a property now where the guy is wanting to sell, and it's a great time for him to sell. He'd get a great price, but he's got lots of money. He doesn't need to sell. Like he was like, yeah, but you know, I could just renovate it and live in it. I was like, but you'll lose money. He's like, and? Like, he doesn't need the money. You know, he makes tens of millions of dollars a year. So an extra 5 million here or there doesn't matter. So I think focusing on the person you're dealing with and thinking about what they want is far more important than just going in with like the rote lines that you think are the most persuasive.
You know, we have this in startups as well, right? Like, you know, I can sit here and yap on about any tech solution that I built, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the problem, it doesn't matter. And like the key thing is understanding what the person on the other end of the table really wants. So going into a pitch meeting even is never, here's my demo
Yeah.
and like, deal with it. It's always, what's the problem you're facing? Oh, happens to be one of the slides that we have on here. So I totally resonate with that part. So you were obviously quite early into quite a few things, social media being one of them. You used to have these hype campaign videos, or rather you hitting a golf ball straight into the hole in one. And these are the kind of things that you used to do before. So talk to me why you thought it was important for you to be on social media. And, you were obviously quite established in the sense that, it should be enough to say I worked for the Prime Minister. Surely you should trust me with buying and selling $1 million homes.
You'd think so, but no, look, that doesn't work. You can even sit here and say I sell this many properties a year, and that doesn't necessarily work either. I think, look, one thing that when it came to social media is I wasn't even on Instagram. If you go back 6 years ago, probably, maybe even 5 years ago, I can't remember when I joined it, and I joined it for work. I never really bothered with it. I was on Facebook still, but again, didn't really bother with that. No, I have probably cancelled my MySpace account now. But I remember I started it because I was like, oh, this seems to be a good way of connecting. Yeah. And honestly, when I started out going down that path, it was heavily influenced by, I watched a lot of $1 Million Listing at New York and LA, and I loved those shows because it was good real estate stuff. And just, when I started, I remember going, I had a videographer at the time, and I was like, I want to start doing videos. So we went and shot the first one, and I always had in this mind, I'm going to be like the Ryan Serhant of Dubai. And then you realize when you actually start doing this stuff, you have to be yourself on camera. If you fake it, it doesn't work. You have to be authentic. And my authenticity was not smooth or cool or, even what I thought it would be, which is sort of, knowledgeable and interesting. It was just quite British and self-deprecating. So I ended up just sort of walking into places and looking around and be like, oh, there's a trampoline there. Let's do something stupid here. And can we do that? And it just sort of went from there. And at the time, it was quite, I think, innovative. No one was really, I think a lot of the videos were these slow panning videos everywhere. It was all very boring. And that was what helped build my own brand and my then, company's brand at the time to sort of position us in a way that actually got traction and sort of got your name out there, because ultimately as a broker network is everything. So it's 100%. Not just clients, it's brokers. So you want brokers to know who you are, so they'll call you if they want something. So I went through quite a heavy phase of sort of doing that, and then obviously I probably did about 12, 15 videos, something like that. I don't have my YouTube anymore, and sort of that Instagram stuff isn't live anymore. But then by the time I was like, I should do it again, other people had innovated. Farouk came along. You did. And he was better, smoother, cooler than me, and did it well. And I look at stuff now, and there's a lot of bad copycats that are out there, but I look at stuff now and I'm like, well, I can't come back and do that. It's not innovative if I do another video jumping in a pool or wrestling a shark. It's boring now. So unless you have something that's going to stand out, I don't think there's any point, which is why you don't see me now doing many pieces to camera that aren't unless they're educational or for the market. I don't really need to do video tours now. It's not really going to be. I want to do something if it's going to resonate and make people laugh, or ideally sell something. But I would quite like to do it again.
No,
but,
fair.
I
think
tempting.
you should, and maybe collab with Farouk on that one.
We've done a couple of videos with Farouk. The last one
Nice.
I did with him, actually, we just walked through the house and we were finished in 35 minutes. He was like, it's amazing. We just there were no second takes. So I was like, well, we've both done this quite a bit before. So it's always good to work with them.
That's awesome. And, you spoke about network and, also guys like Farouk. Both of you happened to be at this event yesterday or day before, which was the top 30 brokers in the country. It was by Arabian Business, I believe. And you got recognized as one of the top 30 brokers in the UAE. What does it take to become one of the top 30 brokers? And
I had to pay a lot of people off.
You pay? Okay, that's fine.
It was. I actually mortgaged a house to try getting there.
Okay.
It was honestly, it was very, very nice to be recognized like that. There's a lot of award ceremonies out there. I've been fortunate enough to win some. With Property Finder in the past, I annoyingly got Best Broker of the Year.
Wow.
In the year of COVID, when there wasn't actually a event.
Right.
So, and then everyone had their photos done on that day at their houses with the trophy. But we had COVID, so the photographer couldn't come around. So I didn't even get a photo. So no, honestly, like when I walked into that room and looked around, there's some incredible brokers there. People in this industry I have massive respect for who have done and achieved like really, really amazing things. So it was just nice to sort of be around that group, and a lot of people like sharing ideas and just chatting and trying to figure out what each other are up to. So it's always a pleasure.
So how can a new agent become one of those top 30 brokers?
Honestly, time and consistency. There was not a single person in that room that's been doing it for less than 5 years. And I think, when you're starting out, you've got to realize it doesn't happen overnight. I tried to tell all my team that, I had one of my new brokers asking me like, how did you get this? Where do you get your clients from? And I was like, I started out literally with printouts of photos from Property Finder, driving around Emirates Hills, trying to figure out what property that looks like the outside of, that's, P32, whatever it was, and then trying to target that for a listing.
Wow.
So you have to start out doing the grunt work, and it takes time. But ultimately, the more deals you do, the more referrals you get. And I think one of the things I've been really happy for is I've got clients who have come back to me over time because hopefully I've given them good advice. I think if you want to be the best, you got to remember you're not a salesperson. You're an advisor. Like the people you are selling to predominantly are probably more wealthy, more successful, potentially more switched on than you are. So how are you going to sell to someone that's worth $150 million or $1 billion? They don't need you to do that.
Them.
What they need you is to basically give them the context in which they can make a decision, and to not bullshit them, not try to sell them on something. Half the time I think I get more success because I'm constantly telling people not to buy stuff that I don't rate myself, and that means that they realize actually I'm not just invested in making that one sale. I prefer to see you buy products over the right amount of time that actually give you decent returns.
Right. And you obviously deal with a lot of ultra high net worths in that process, as you mentioned, and you've also been to Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., all these travels. Big follower. But tell me about how the rich invest differently in different parts of the world, from your standpoint.
I think it's really important to look at, one thing is the fact that not everyone is just obsessed by residential. When it comes to investment, a lot of people look down commercial routes. So, people are looking, if you're looking here, warehousing, great success, people that own offices and industrial assets and things. When it comes to the wealthy globally, I think it's important to look at why they're investing, why they're buying, the extent to which they want to leverage or take risk. Obviously a lot of them are all cash, but a lot of them have potentially got there through using leverage, through using bank financing, mortgaging. I think a lot of the time as well, you're trying to look at what are the types of assets they like, and there's got to be a rationale. But this isn't just for the rich. I think too many people say, oh, this is a great deal. Like, well, why is it a great deal? Do people, some people just focus on prime. I've got clients who, unless it's a super prime location, they just won't touch it. They will only buy from government-backed developers in prime locations. That's their rationale. Other people say, well, no, look, I want yield. I'm basically just, as long as I'm squeezing my yield and that's what I'm going to do, that's going to be the push. So I find that everyone's different. And definitely globally, we do a lot to try, bring things together. I in Hong Kong a couple of weeks ago, we had a client out there that's looking to sell 8 units in Hong Kong to then reinvest here. Equally, that property I just came from, he owns here and lives here, but actually just, asked me as well to connect us with his Hong Kong office to sell properties there. So you're trying to also marry up. And one of the nice things about my role now is that we can really offer a genuinely global service. Just like 2 hours ago, I had a client viewing a £42 million property in central London. Last week I had someone in Capdon-Tebes. So having that sort of breadth to try offer a broader service hopefully elevates you beyond that broker that just does this into just someone that's helpful with their real estate, basically.
Right. And you offer an end-to-end solution, global solution, like you said. And Savills is an estate agency in the UK that, that's where it was founded, right? I believe.
Yeah, so we're over 150 years old, and I
Right.
think we've got 700 offices, 40,000 people globally. So I think we're one of the few people who genuinely are, and we're all wholly owned. So this is no franchising, no just a nameplate. My bosses, I report directly into the guys in London. So it genuinely is an option of right, you want to buy a home here, I can 100% connect you to someone, and that person's probably a market leader in that area. So it's a really beneficial element. We had an event last week about the old War Office. We had 50 ultra high net worth clients come to raffles. We had the cinema booked out, black tie, and the ability to offer this super high end product that starts at, for context, around 40,000 dirham per square foot.
Wow.
So punchy.
I think we're at 750 normally,
well, it
right?
reminds you that Dubai is still cheap. But being able to offer that to them whilst also talking about what they're doing here is an advantage that, to be honest, not really any other companies have.
Right. And you've said this before. You said, I think it was 750 dirhams or something like that per square feet.
Dollars. $841 or something like this. So it's $800 and something per square foot on average. Yeah.
For just average properties out here. Is that just prime or is that...
mainly prime. But like you contrast that with the UK, Dubai's still 1/3 the price. It's 1/5 the price of Singapore. It's about 1/10 the price of Monaco. So it still offers comparative value, so that people come in and actually this is still a good deal.
Yeah, and there's still more to come. There's which is really insane. So you've got this global operation. The point I was trying to come to was effectively what you think about the fact that there's 5,000 plus brokerages in Dubai, which is a very competitive market. And let's say even if 50% of that is just like, folks with like holding companies or whatever it might be, how do you think a global brand competes with local competition or works hand in hand with them? And then I'll get into a little thing about estate agencies versus brokerages in a bit.
Well, look, I think what's really interesting is, for the most part, global brands in Dubai have not been historically as successful at residential because they've often looked at Dubai through the prism of the UK or elsewhere. So, you can bring over a top UK agent and try put them in and then get them to run it. Now, if you plonked me in the middle of Mayfair or Knightsbridge, I would fail. I'm not a UK broker. I would never be a UK estate agent. That's not what I know and not what I do. I think what we're doing now is, my background is purely Dubai. So I know how to run Dubai brokerages. I built and scaled them before. Having that with an international brand is just, a huge advantage. And a lot of people said to me like, why don't you start up your own company again? Why don't you go solo? But the benefits I see from these brands are staggering. It's, when you go into a listing pitch, everyone predominantly, their marketing is, look, a lot of companies have got great databases. Don't get me wrong. You've been around 10, 15 years, your databases are great. But the rest of your marketing mostly is going to be portals, quite reasonably, and maybe with a little bit of ancillary stuff. A couple of them have good websites and things like this. We do all that, but we also have 700 offices, 40,000 people. We have the ability to run always-on campaigns in the UK, targeting all of the buyers and things that we've had from the UK. You get leads. I went back to London. I did a presentation at the London regional meeting. After the meeting, I met with the London heads. One of them, who was actually didn't know much about Dubai and was a bit like, I'm not sure. Like, what? I said, look, just speak to your buyers. Mention Dubai to them. Just see what the reaction is. 45 minutes later, I get an email introducing me to someone in St. John's Wood. I went to her house that night. Guy's got 50 million dirhams, actually 35 to 50 million dirhams to spend, and he's moving to Dubai. That never came through a portal, never came from anywhere else. If we harness these international networks, that's the comparative advantage a global company has. Right. It doesn't mean we don't need to do the same thing as all the best companies that are here. Every other company that's here that does good business here, we need to be doing the same. We need good coverage on the portals and everything else. But it's about the extra value add that a company like ours can bring, basically.
So network referral and technology, effectively. How would you say Savills is looking at technology? What are you guys doing differently from everybody else?
So look, Savills is a huge global company. You know,
Right.
where I think we've got a revenue of 10 billion dirhams as an example.
Right.
So technology is varied across the company. And actually, I've been looking at a lot of things that the company's doing. You know, in the UK, I met with Andrew Cummings, who's the head of our UK residential, and hearing about some of the really innovative stuff they're doing there with AI to basically better target their client base. You know, we're also looking at how we can coordinate on ultra high net worths. So at the moment, you know, you'll hear a name is in the market. I can drop it into a group and get an answer on if we know them in about 10 minutes. You know, and 90% of the time we know them and we can get to them. So like, because we've had past dealings with them one place or another. I just came from Singapore where our business there, which also has some incredible things. They're working with a big data company. They've created an entire platform for a lot of their property management and their rental. So if you do a deal with Savills, basically you get access to this portal, and your portal will show you what your portfolio is worth, what the yield it's currently getting, when the tenancy renewal is, and that's all been developed in-house. So there's a lot of stuff I'm looking at the moment in terms of what the business is doing globally, and then what works in Dubai, because one of the challenges of a big corporate is not everything works in each country. So, you know, a CRM that works really well in the UK, for example, is because it targets vendors and sellers. But we need to focus on buyers as well. So you have to basically try balance and take the best of the different pieces that we have together.
Right. And what are your sort of highlights of the Dubai market that you sort of talk about with these clients as well? Obviously, you know, when you're talking to these buyers that are looking for the best prime locations, etc., I'm sure you have your core stats that you go to every single time.
Yeah, look, I always love the 4,500 millionaires moved to Dubai last year.
Wow.
The $10 million sales thing is, you know, is by far, I think, one of the most compelling.
Above New York, I believe.
Yeah, so like, you know, if you go back, I remember when I think it was 92 deals in 2021, which was more than the previous 7 years combined, and we all thought it was incredible. The 2022, it rises to 230 odd, which ranked as third behind, I think, New York and London. And then last year, you know, nearly 450, double the number of $10 million plus sales than in either London or New York. That stat alone reminds everyone that this isn't a flash in the pan. Dubai has gone through a generational shift in what it is. It's sort of reached a level of maturity, which I think now puts it on a different trajectory for the coming future.
Right. And brokerage as a whole is evolving because of this, right? Like, I think in the context of people keep asking you this question, I've seen it a few times now. Is Dubai in a bubble? Is there a bubble going on? And like, that seems to be the thing. Let's assume that the market is going to have, at some point, will, like, you know, slow down to, or rather not grow as quickly as it is right now. How does the brokerage offering need to evolve to service a market that isn't entirely sales driven, right?
So look, I think one of the things is about trying to offer good, you know, end-to-end service. You know, like the companies that are able to leverage their clients and basically be part of that sales process, rent the property for them, manage the property for them, you know, whether, you know, short-term let the property for them, and keep that in-house. That, you know, I think looking for ways to have sort of what I sort of call sticky contact with the clients. So it's not always salesy, you know, constantly contacting people and asking if they want to sell their house is not an effective sales strategy. Offering some value, and look, I own property here. I get 400 WhatsApps a day like everyone else, and but every now and again I'll forward one on into my management team. But this was clever. We should look at this. You know, so trying to add value. For me, a lot of that is around research. People care what the house is worth. People care what's going on in the market. So if you can get good, you know, unbiased research, and obviously as Savills, that's something that we do and we put out. It's a big advantage. You know, we obviously are a, you know, a FTSE listed company, so you can't. I always joke that, you know, I can't influence our research team. You know, like that it is just done on the numbers, and I get whatever those results are. So offering these type of things, I think, is an advantage. But what brokers have to do in this, you know, increasingly competitive market is you've got to add value. You know, like, but equally, what's nice while this market is busy is brokers need to respect themselves, need to respect their own time. You know, if a client is rude to you, not a serious person, not wanting to sell, not wanting to do this, don't work with them. Like you don't have to. 5 years ago, we all had to scramble around to try get whatever scraps you could. But now, prioritize the deals that you think will close, the sellers that really want to sell, the people that are going to really buy, and put your energy fully into those. And that's probably going to be what's going to give you most success.
Right. And that's just because Dubai has become a long-term place. There's more people in the market. Also, like the trade-off between sort of buying and renting and things like that are becoming a little bit more closer. So then you're just like, I'd rather buy. So like you said, brokers don't need to fight for scraps. They can go for the deals that make sense. In that sense, Dubai has changed quite a bit post-pandemic, especially. How do you think the future of Dubai really looks like?
So I think positive on the macro level, but I think what you have to do constantly is just realize the speed of change. And, as someone who's worked in government before and seen the very, very slow, incremental snail's pace of change, this city moves rapidly. I always joke that, in the time that the UK has debated whether to build a third runway at Heathrow, the entire of Dubai has been built. So imagine what's going to be done in the next 20 years. I think what you've got to look at as well is that speed means that sometimes people's memories can get conflicted. So a lot of people, when they're talking about bubble, they'll go back to 2008. And they forget that 2008 was, 5 years after freehold came in. There was not really any regulation. You didn't have escrow. It wasn't even a serious, mature market. Now we have DLD, we have escrow, we've got digitalization, we've got all of these other things that make it mature. So I think that you need to look at that pace, not constantly look back and think that things will always go back. In the same way that where markets come up and down, it doesn't always have to come up to the same level, and it doesn't always have to go down to the same level.
Right.
So where I see is a government that's making every single change it can to increase the population. When I moved here, I always used to say, wow, if they bring in like a US green card type approach, it will be a massive boon to the market. And they've not just done that, they've gone dozens of different types of visa options. The build and they will come has changed to build and they will come and they will stay. With the investment in hospitals and schools and infrastructure and amenities. So I think the city's going to keep going. The big thing I think is going to start changing is Dubai is going to become more fragmented. I think that traditionally, and you see this in groups, traditionally people will sit there and say, oh, but I should be able to live on the Palm and go to dinner in DIFC, and I should be able to go do this, and all of it in a 20-minute drive. And yes, Dubai has this scheme now to try to keep things close. But what I think you're going to see is people will start living in communities. When I lived in London and I lived in Islington, or when I lived in Tooting, I lived in those places. When I was in Islington, I didn't go out in Balham, which is in South London. I just went out in Islington. When I lived in Clapham, I basically just went out in Clapham. I think you're going to see that more. I live in the Marina at the moment. I'm moving to Tal Al Ghaf next year. But I go out in the Marina. I go out on JBR. I'll go to Blue Waters. I might stretch to the Palm. I rarely go out to DIFC. So I think what you're going to see with the advent of communities growing up in the south of the city, in the east of the city as well, you're going to see prime areas going to become more prime, and you're going to see more integrated communities where that's the community you live in. And over time, I think you'll probably work in those communities as well, and it will become a more traditional city with different communities within it.
So it's interesting you say that, because in the UK, we were at PF Connect, obviously, not too long ago, and I believe it was the MD or former MD of Foxtons or something like that was there. And he was talking about how they have these kind of retail stores that you walk in and there's a Foxtons label on the outside and things like that. How does a brokerage in Dubai approach the fact that communities will become more localized and fragmented, as you said? How can they then target each one of these communities?
So I don't think that localization necessarily tracks to an impact on brokerages. I've always been one that's, I firmly believe in digital. The company that I set up, when I did it, was a purely digital endeavor. We were all about the website, driving digital traffic, and that was a core to it. Right. You can meet people now online. That is the place to target them. Is having a retail shop going to bring you clients? Yeah, it might do, it might not. Probably not, because there's a lot less walking in Dubai as well. So you're realistically going to put people in malls or hotels.
Yeah.
So I think that really that localization is going to mean that you're going to need greater area expertise. I think the best agents in the city already predominantly are area experts.
Right.
And I think that will continue to be the case as things expand. It's going to be harder as a job. Even now, just keeping up with the number of launches and things. I thought I was quite encyclopedic on this. Now I just can't keep up. So in a few years time, whereas now I get a client coming in and look, it's easier at the top level because there's not that many locations for say 20, 30 million dirham plus. But if you've got someone that's got 5 million dirhams to 6 million dirhams, there's going to be 30 places you need to show them, and that's going to be a challenge for a day-to-day broker, because that broker might only know 5 to 10 of them. So that's gonna, I think, lead to brokerages, and a lot of them are scaling, needing to have really good interoperability between their different teams so that you're sharing clients more effectively.
You know what my take on this is? The whole VR concept is becoming more of a big deal. There's folks that are doing it for the gimmicks right now. But what it will become will be interesting in the sense that it might save brokers time, right? In the sense that you can show 6 communities and then go and actually, virtually speaking, and then actually double down on the one that, interests the client the most, so that you're saving both of your time, right? So virtually walk through 5 communities, the 6th one, go in person. Right, and I think that might be a very interesting way to.
Well, I think there's part of this. I was talking to one of my team this morning who was showing me something that they do, where they effectively harness, elements of Google to showcase their properties. So you can just bring them up, and where I see that going is, you're a broker with an iPad. You can show them a map of the city. You can click on the address. It pops up the property. It has a full walkthrough, and then you can do a much more immersive thing, because actually a lot of that is around the shortlisting. You start off with a lot of properties. By the time you get down to shortlist, you need to go view them. But that first, hey, I'm moving to Dubai, what should I look at? You need it to be smoother, and it can't be what it is today, which is people hammering you with 120 photos on WhatsApp, or sending you links to sort of ropey CRM listings and things. We've got to get to a more tech-focused place, which makes it easier for the consumer to work, basically.
And how does the average brokerage owner get familiar with technology, right? How do they get to a place where they can accept the fact that technology is a fundamental part of business, and you need to be on top of that so you can be on top of your business?
Well, look, I hope many of them don't. It gives us a competitive advantage. But I think that, you've got to understand why. My wife works for a very large management consultancy firm, top 3 management consultancy firm globally, and they literally do staggering amounts of stuff on ChatGPT, but it's not just logging on. They've built a model with ChatGPT to run a lot of their business. A lot of these type of solutions, that we talk about, that we want to see happen, they already actually exist, but real estate haven't really adopted them. So anyone who says that I'm innovating in tech, in real estate, they're not. Half the other industries are doing stuff way better than we are, and actually brokerages need to start stepping up, because I think what you'll see over time is that actually, the ones that give the best, smoothest tech experience ease the customer's efforts, and that's where the value add is. So if you can start giving that, and look, I've seen some. I'm not going to mention them because his head will get too big. But there's one very large website with one very tall gentleman who runs it, who has the sold values on the website. He was one of the first people to put it up there alongside Property Finder. Brilliant idea. Like, why not do that? Why has everyone else done that? They haven't done it because they haven't bothered to realize that they can get the land department feed and just plug it in. It's a perfect investment to make. So, doing all of these things is a value add. It's not about, silly tech. Some people publish things, we're going to do this. It doesn't really matter. You've got to get tech that basically adds value to the client or reduces the amount of bureaucracy and time that it takes for agents. Right. At the moment, I always look at, you don't want agents to do 90% of the things they're doing. You want them focusing on selling. Yep. So how can tech increase the amount of productivity that your agents are basically doing? That's where I think you'll see more benefits coming for owners.
Absolutely. So I'm going to switch gears now a little bit. you're quite entrepreneurial in the sense that it's not every day that you hop from career
It's
path
weird
to
though,
career
because
path.
I actually don't think I am.
You don't think
No,
you're
like
entrepreneurial?
I
Okay.
still think that it's really weird because
Yeah.
I've always thought that I'm incredibly conservative. I'm, scared to make big change,
Risk
and I'm
averse.
nervous about taking big jumps, and
Yeah.
I don't take enough risk. And then I think if you actually look at the facts, I probably have done that, but it's never felt like I've done it. So I've never really considered myself, even though I set up my own business and built my own business, I didn't really consider myself entrepreneurial. In some ways, going back into corporate, is that because I'm not entrepreneurial, but then I'm having to build something, as if I am a startup anyway. So it is strange, again, this is a self-reflection thing of, how you see yourself. I still think of myself as quite a straight-laced civil servant. So it's trying to get out of that mindset, which is a bit different.
So what from that entrepreneurial world resonates with you the most? Because I understand that you say that you're quite risk averse, but then you've made all these jumps that other people might consider big, or rather a little bit of a leap outside of their comfort zone. So what do you resonates from the world of entrepreneurship with what you do?
I think freedom. I think the ability to take your own decisions. It doesn't mean not reporting to people. I report to people now, and and that's great. I love having people to bounce off. I've got a fantastic sales director, management team that work around me that I get to sort of bounce off. I have management both here in the UAE and then globally that you can do it. I think what I like is the ability to try different things, to come up with an idea. And the challenge is, when I was a management consultant, you focused a lot on how you implement that. One of the things that is most challenging, I find, as an entrepreneur is trying to make sure that you do implement. It's very easy to sit around and come up with some zany scheme,
right?
But delivering it is actually the real, the real challenge and, the real achievement in doing it. So I think that's something that, when I look at a lot of the top entrepreneurs in this space, I really admire when they set out and deliver a product or something that they're doing, which I'm like, wow, that's really cool. Because they actually did it. They didn't just talk about it, basically.
Right.
They've advanced their business in some way, shape or form. So that's probably the thing I enjoy most, just that ability to, try things more than anything.
I personally just sit on the podcast most of the time. This is my day job.
It's very
CEO.
comfortable, so it's fine. Yeah.
it's really fun. But so autonomy, that's a great thing to take away from entrepreneurship, I feel. Talk to me about, and this is my final question, what advice would you give your 21-year-old self?
God, it's hard. It's so hard because it's funny. It's a little bit like childhood. My wife thinks I'm a bit mad because my mother died when I was 4. My father remarried, they got divorced. I moved between a bunch of different cities. One day I just got picked up and dumped in, my grandparents' houses. I went to boarding school. All these weird things happened, but I love my childhood. And and I'm pretty certain I probably need therapy for it, but I don't want to dig into it in any way. And I look back now, and you take that period from 21 onwards, and I wouldn't change anything. I think you need to basically figure out what you're good at, but what you enjoy. And there's 2 things though. It's all well and good to sit here at age 42 and say, do what you love. Not when you're 21. Don't do that. Do what makes sense. I did a biochemistry degree because it would give me a good numeric discipline. I get a 2-1 and it would be great to go to get an employer. That was a good strategic, boring decision, basically. There are things at 21 you should do because they are good things that will build for you. You've been a real estate broker for a year and you think you're really good and you go set up on your own. Really? Is that the best decision? Applaud you if you make it work, but actually building a network, utilizing and learning off others actually might get you so that when you're 25 and you do that, you actually have a lot more impact. So for me, I think it's it's learn skills, focus on skills, because when I look at brokers or interviewing, whatever it is, it's about your skill set. Attitude, of course, can't, in my view, you can't replicate attitude. You've either got it or you don't. But skills and how you utilize those are key. I came from a background, I'd never done sales, never done real estate, but my skill set transferred into sales. And I think trying to learn what you're good at, do self-improvement and change will make a big difference for people. And if you're young, I look now and say, don't be afraid to take risks, but I took literally none. I would say probably do things a little bit differently to I.
So I think that's interesting. And, you say there's things that you should just do because you should do them very early on so you can develop these skills.
Yeah, look, university. University is not for everyone. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
I was, university was the direction I went. Did it have any advantage that I have a degree in biochemistry? No, of course. I've never done any biochemistry. Although, I did do Ebola as my undergraduate thesis, which again, not come in very handy.
Yep.
But what did it give me? It gave me discipline. It helped teach me to learn. It improved my social skills at uni, obviously. There's a lot of skills that I picked up from going to university, which I think benefited me down the line. Now, can you get other skills from doing a non-university path? Yeah, you can. But, I think you've got to look at what are the types of things that will help? What experiences can you gain that will make you a more competitive creature than the person next to you?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because 21-year-olds today just easy apply on LinkedIn and hope something happens.
Yeah.
And that's not how it works.
Yeah.
Like any friend of mine, which quite a lot of them, because my age bracket's slightly different, they're still...
You're really highlighting our age difference. That's harsh. Someone did that to me at the PF. Actually, I'll call him out, Conor McKay. Conor McKay basically said, are you saying we're in the same peer group? Because I think there's an age difference. So I was like, oh, Conor, there's 15 years. That's harsh.
Well, you see, like sometimes I like to feel like I'm 40 and other times I like to be 25.
When you're 40, you definitely never feel it. You always feel like you're still 25. So
That's
your
awesome.
brain says that, even if all of your body doesn't.
No, absolutely. So, I mean, my whole point was just that people need to be doing more to set themselves apart. And I think people underestimate the value of things like LinkedIn, building your personal brand, because at the end of the day, if everyone can do the same things, everyone has a commoditized skill set. The only thing that sets them apart is distribution and what the networks that they actually have access to. Like you said, it takes time to build those things. For me, I started building mine when I was just in my first year of university. I was just like doing this. Probably not the best thing. I should have had a little bit more fun. But net, I'm really grateful that I did that because everyone's just followed the journey. If you're someone that people are invested in, they're willing to do deals with you, or they've seen your journey, so they feel like they know you. Whereas most folks today are just kind of hitting
I think actually one of the biggest things that if you ask me for one tip, don't be afraid of rejection. I am. Like, and maybe this was growing up, if I was, see a woman, I'm going to get rejected or whatever it is. But like, I think that I think being afraid of rejection, going for a job, going for a listing, speaking to a seller, not wanting to put an offer in, whatever it is, whatever part, however micro or macro it is, you always got to, if you can just come back to, so what if they say no? What's the worst thing that can happen? They say no. That's not actually a big deal. It's not you. It's not personal. It's a business thing. When you start, and that's the one thing I'll find is I don't take anything personally in this industry. Like, we're in business. Like, if someone gets in a deal ahead of me, or just recently someone we got quite
competitive,
quite screwed out of a deal, which was for one of my team, it was 2.8 million of commission. The client had us set up a viewing of this thing in the morning, claimed they were ill, and then went later that day and closed it with someone else. And I have a good idea why they would have closed it with someone else financially. And look, it's frustrating. Doesn't bother me. Like, I think the key thing now is have a thick skin. Don't take it personally, because it's not you. It's not a reflection on you. These are business decisions. And if you can be less worried about rejection, you'll put yourself out there more. And if you put yourself out there more, you'll get more opportunities. And that's really what it's about, whether that's in a networking sense. And this is hilarious because everyone thinks that I'm this crazy extrovert. You put me in a networking event, I'll pretend to be on the phone because I don't like walking up and saying hello to people. I can't bring myself to do it. If someone is near me and says something, and I'll make a little joke. Once I've done that, I'll take over the room and I'm fine. And I'll do a talk in front of 1,000 people, no issues. But I don't like saying, "Oh, hi, I'm Andrew." Because I'm afraid of rejection. So if you can overcome that, and I always think that's my biggest regret. If I could have overcome that, imagine the amount of people I could have met. And the opportunities that could have come from that.
100%. And that was my approach with inviting you to this podcast. I was pretty persistent, I'd say, and borderline annoying. Probably crossed that line a little bit. But I'm glad you came on, Andrew. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. And Tune in next week for another episode of The Real Ones. Don't forget to smash that subscribe button. And that's been us. Yeah.